This is Awareness Explorers.
Welcome back, friends and family, to Awareness Explorers. Good to have you. We have a special guest today, Dr. Roger Walsh, who I am a big fan of and have been for about 40 years now. But before we do an interview of Roger, I want to say hi to my co-host. How you doing, Brian?
I am very well, Jonathan. I'm really looking forward to this chat today.
You know, one of the things about Dr. Walsh that I like is just he has broad interest in so many topics around spirituality. So let's go right into his bio. Roger Walsh, MD, PhD, DHL, is a professor emeritus of psychiatry, philosophy, and anthropology at UC Irvine, where he does research focused on topics such as meditation, psychological well-being, wisdom, and our global crisis. His books include Essential Spirituality, The Seven Central Practices, The World of Shamanism, The Psychology of Human Survival, and The World's Great Wisdom. His research and writings have received over 20 national and international awards. He's a student, researcher, and teacher of contemplative traditions and an authorized Lama in Tibetan Buddhism. With John Dupuy, he co-hosts the podcasts Deep Transformation, Self, Society, Spirit, with listeners in over 130 countries. His more curious careers include having been a circus acrobat and having an extremely brief and unsuccessful career as a stand-up comedian. Well, Roger, welcome to Awareness Explorers.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jonathan, and thank you, Brian.
Well, where should we start? There's so many places here. You know, with your late wife, Frances Vaughan, you almost like were one of the most important introduction books to transpersonal psychology. How'd you get into all this, what my dad used to call weird stuff as an MD?
Well, that's exactly what I thought it was for so much of my life. Let's see. Well, I was born in Australia, went through my medical school and scientific training there, came to California to Stanford to do my psychiatry training, and California has a way of changing people. I was doing therapy on people and didn't really think it worked, and probably in my hands at that stage it didn't. But I felt I had a moral obligation to try a little of myself. So I went in for what I thought would be a few weeks of therapy with a remarkable therapist by the name of Jim Bugenthal. And Jim was able to help me tune into my inner world, which I had not known existed. And I ended up very quickly feeling like I'd spent my entire life living on the top 6 inches of a wave on top of an inner ocean that I didn't even know existed. And it just blew me away. I mean, how could I have spent my entire life unaware of this? And as I looked around at our culture, it seemed like 99% of the world and the culture was also unaware of this. And I was really shaken, and it took me quite some time to begin putting this together. And I dove into a lot of other practices and eventually found myself doing contemplative practices, you know, chanting, drumming, trying meditation without much success. And I couldn't figure out why, because I knew religion was the opiate of the masses. And why was I becoming addicted to an opiate or trying an opiate? I just wrestled with this question. And one day, literally, as I was walking across the living room floor, it hit me that behind the conventional institutions with their myths and dogmas and rituals were a family of psycho-spiritual technologies for training the mind and inducing the same states and realizations the founders had realized. Mm-hmm. And that literally the esoteric, little-known aspects of the great religions were psycho-spiritual technologies. And there were two kinds of religion. There's a conventional religion, which centers on believing in a narrative, a story, a particular story. If you believe the story, you're saved. If you don't, you're damned. And there's a much less well-known religious tradition which centers on transforming heart and mind and inducing the similar realizations, states of mind, etc., as the founders had. So that just totally blew my world open, and I've been trying to make sense of it ever since.
Uh-huh.
Yes, it seems to me that even though we think of all the religions as very different from each other, there's sort of one level, maybe you would call it the mystical tradition, or the people who are looking for a direct experience of the divine, that they all have much more in common with each other than we think about. That underneath all religions, that core seems to be very similar and run through it a lot.
Yeah, I think you're right, Brian. I would probably want to nuance that. In fact, you're giving voice to what's sometimes called the transcendental unity of religions, that in their transcendental realizations, the idea was that there's a unity. I think with our contemporary understanding over the last few decades of contemplative practices and mystical traditions across the world, and keep in mind, as you well know, this is the first time in history we've had all the world's traditions available to us to do the kind of comparative analyses that we can now do. And also, for the first time in the West, we've had a psychology of states of consciousness and developmental stages by which we can analyze these traditions. So whereas there was this recognition of what's called the transcendental unity of mystical traditions that you point to, now I think we have to be significantly more nuanced and recognize that the realizations are not exactly the same across traditions. They have what, for example, Hamid Ali calls a different logos or realizations. They also have different states and culminating states to some degree. And they also have their center of gravity around different degrees of and kinds of altered states. So I think we can give a more nuanced discernment of what was formerly just glossed as the transcendental unity of traditions.
Mm-hmm. I've been involved in the work of Dr. Jeffrey Martin, who you might know, and he has.
I know him more as a result of having read your book.
Yeah, so he talks about different locations or different types of enlightenment or awakening, which is very interesting, and he teaches courses to get into these different locations. You've been in this ball game.
Can I just say something, Jonathan? That I appreciated your summaries of his work, and he, as you point out, he has 4 main divisions, and if we look at them, they seem largely based on the depth and the stability of certain altered states. I don't think he, as I look at it, he doesn't seem to be mapping nuances of the different families of states. For example, concentrative states, awareness states, different kinds of awareness states, such as Sahaj, Samadhi, Nirvikalpa, etc., etc. So I think it's a useful first categorization, but there's more work to be done, which I'm sure you'd agree with.
Yeah.
Not saying anything you don't know.
And since the book was written a year ago, he's actually created more nuanced.
Oh, he has. Oh, great.
Yeah. So, you've been in this ball game for a long time. I'm curious how you see it's changing, and if you see any sense of where the direction might be leading.
Let's see, you're thinking now of our understanding of these traditions.
Yeah, and how, call it the whole area of spirituality is changing. Like, for example, I interviewed a lot of spiritual teachers 40 years ago or 35 years ago. And at that time, things like the word God were very used. Now hardly anyone uses that term. Nobody in the 40 people I interviewed really talked about somatic practices. So those are a couple of things I've noticed are major differences. But I'm wondering what you've noticed is the trends that you see.
Let's see. That's an interesting question, and particularly if we can project anything from that. Well, let's see. Of course, there have been waves that have occurred. If we start back with the introduction of psychedelics in the 60s, that the psychedelics unleashed on a very unsuspecting, naive Western world the recognition that there was an extraordinary plasticity of consciousness that was available, and that it was quite possible for us all to access a wide variety of altered states, which we in the West had known nothing about. We were in the West what's called a monophasic society. This is an anthropological term, meaning that we derived our worldview primarily from one state of consciousness, namely the waking state, as opposed to most other cultures, which are polyphasic. They draw their worldview not only from the waking state, but, for example, from dreams, from trance states, from spiritual states of one kind or another, from fasting, etc. So in one way, they have a richer repertoire of states from which they draw in their understanding of themselves and reality. So I would say one of the big overarching but almost never recognized evolutions in the West has been the transition which we are still undergoing from a monophasic society to a polyphasic society.
Hallelujah.
And
Hallelujah.
Yeah, and once you appreciate that, then a lot of things begin to make sense. For example, everything, if you look back, say, from the 60s, the Cultural Revolution, that was a birth of initial birth of polyphasic segments of society and a clash between polyphasic and monophasic elements of society. So that has been continuing. Following that, there was an influx of traditions from the East, and we are all beneficiaries of that. And that in turn led to the recognition that, oh, wait a minute, our own Western religious traditions contain, hidden behind the mainstream conventional myths and dogmas and institutions, do contain contemplative practices. They've just been hidden, and in some cases necessarily so, because they could lead to realizations which led to an identity with the divine. And that was for example, the Western monotheism, Judaism, Jesus got crucified for that realization. In Islam, Al-Hallaj got crucified for the same realization, and the West people got put on funeral pyres for that realization. So it was basically viewed as heresy. But there has been this recognition that, yes, our Western traditions do contain these practices. They're not as well known, but they're gradually coming out of the closet. And some practices, such as Father Thomas Keating's centering prayer, are now having widespread influences. And so there has been a what we call it, mysticization of or contemplativization of the West as these practices are coming in. There is also a greater diversity of practices now. We have, for the first time in history, all the world's contemplative practices available. And for the first time, we can begin to discern both common factors. And you were kind enough to mention my book, Essential Spirituality, and that's what subtitled 7 Central Practices. And that's what it was basically about. My trying to make sense of looking across these traditions. Well, what are the greatest saints and sages who've ever landed on the planet say are the most important qualities of heart and mind for us all to cultivate? And how do they say we can develop them? So that was my attempt at an answer to that. And I found 7 qualities of heart and mind, like concentration, wisdom, altruism, ethics, etc., which seem to be universal across any authentic tradition. You also point to another trend that's occurred, and that is the interface of psychology and spirituality. I think, I don't know about you, but in my naive phase, I'd love to think I'm not naive now, but if I live longer, I'm sure I will think I am. A lot of us assumed that spiritual practice would do it all. And in most cases, it doesn't. Right. As you pointed out in your nice book, The Enlightenment Project, spiritual practices can leave untouched various elements of the psyche, often known as the shadow elements. There's a beautiful book by Connie Zweig that's just coming out in a couple of weeks called Shadow and Spirituality, I think. So that's recognized, and now one of the gifts and challenges of our time is how do we find the optimal combination of practices for each of us at each stage of our development, and that's an ongoing question. We also have introduced by the West for the first time in history a variety of technologies for inducing altered states. We can think of brain-mind machines, and we can think of psychedelics, and we can also think of two things that none of us would have predicted would have a major impact on the culture, but they have. One is resuscitation technology, with millions of people having had near-death experiences, and you've worked on that. And another is space travel. People have what's called an overview effect. They go into space, they look down on the Earth for the first time, and a number of these people have had life-changing mystical experiences. So here we have four technologies completely unexpected, which are also playing into this potpourri of practices and techniques and ways of accessing altered states we have. And then maybe to round it off, I don't want to take up your whole hour, we now have people who are doing analyses, cross-cultural and cross-traditional analyses of the different traditions, the different states of consciousness, the different practices, and beginning to map them and contrast them and point to systemic maps by which we can really make sense of them the whole way. And the master of this is Ken Wilber, who has produced what's called a meta theory, that is a theory of theories. So he's put together the biggest map we have of the ways in which different traditions and practices cultivate specific states, and the ways in which and the kinds of states they induce, and the sequence in which they tend to emerge. I guess one final thing, drawing on the recent work of Ken Wilber that I'll just add, is it's clear that the contemplative traditions can induce altered states. It's not so clear that they necessarily induce psychological maturation through what are called post-conventional stages. That is, I would say, one of the most important, maybe exciting discovery of psychology in the last 50 years is that we can mature through recognizable stages of development beyond the conventional level, so-called post-conventional stages. It's like changing your operating system. Like an older stage is like changing a program. Change a program, you have different experience. So you can see you're distinctly altered, but developmental stages are more like changing the background operating system. You don't even necessarily recognize you've moved through another stage, but and it requires psychological testing to really be clear about it and to map these stages out. But what we now have is the recognition that great spiritual traditions have given us these incredible techniques and maps for accessing higher states of consciousness. Western psychology is giving us a map of stages of development. Now we have the opportunity to bring them together, and I think a comprehensive and well-tailored program of human flourishing will necessarily entail both and the integration of both.
That was quite an overview. Roger. I think you covered that really well, and it also gives me hope to see that this is progressing. You know, technology is obviously progressing, and the understanding of all this psychological and spiritual maturation. If you look back, 50 years, it's in a totally different ballpark than it was, and so thank you for that overview. Brian, I know you had a question.
Well, as I mentioned before we started the interview, one topic I'm most interested in, and this is really based on my own experience, is that a shift in identity from the personal individual self to a larger field of awareness. It has many, many names for it. Seems to be healthy. It seems to promote well-being and happiness, at least for me. And I watched an interview with you. It was on Closer to Truth, and it was called "What Makes Personality Continue." And you said, what we're taking to be ourselves is actually an image rather than what we really are. We suffer from a case of mistaken identity. So how does this mistake happen, and what is our true identity?
Oh, it's good you're starting with the easy questions. Let's see, what is this? Well, first off, I would agree with what you're implying, Brian, and that is that at the heart of the great contemplative traditions is the recognition and aspiration that what we usually take to be ourselves is actually a very partial and fragmented self-sense, and that there is a far greater identity awaiting recognition. And so what is this, quotes, what I was calling a case of mistaken identity? What is this mistaken identity? Well, first off, we should acknowledge this seems to be part of a developmental progression. And so it's important that, I hesitate to use the word ego because two of the most overused words in the English language, which carry multiple meanings, are ego and self. But maybe if we define our terms carefully and say ego in the way we're using it is referring to the separate self sense, then we can say that the development of the ego is actually a developmental achievement. It takes some years for a child to develop a firm, stable self-representation or separate self-sense, the ego. However, it's ideally an intermediate stage rather than a final stage, as our culture thinks. So, and what is that ego? Well, if you look at it, it's most generally what we would call a self-representation. That is, it's a representation of what it says, self-representation, made up of subcomponents, which are given names like self-concept, self-narrative, self-image. And for anyone who does insight-oriented meditation, looks at their experience, one of the starting revelations is that when we look for our self-sense, what we find is that it is deconstructed into constituent mental elements, a thought, an image, a narrative, a fantasy, etc., etc. However, usually those arise so quickly, and our introspective sensitivity is so blunted or underdeveloped that we suffer from what psychologists call flicker fusion, which is the same thing that happens in a movie. You get a movie as one still frame after another, but due to flicker fusion, the mind creates a movie, quotes. Similarly, we do the same thing with our self-representation, assuming that there is a stable identity, and that is who we are. Now, the contemplative traditions deconstruct that identity in a variety of ways, either through seeing through it, as in, say, Vipassana, by questioning it, as in your practice, Brian, of self-inquiry with Ramana Maharshi, of decathecting it, that is taking energy out of it in, say, karma yoga, by dissolving it in love in bhakti yoga or love practices, etc. And what is found to be underlying that is a transpersonal identity, which, depending on the orientation of the practice, is experienced as, you describe, as pure awareness, vast, boundless pure awareness. In other cases, it may be experienced as pure love, pure mind, as Satchitananda, as self with a capital S, etc. Now, there's debate about to what extent these are the same experience, and there's a lot of people would say, well, they're just different facets, and probably they are. People like Hamid Ali, who's certainly a spiritual genius, says, they're not, people think they're all the same, but they're not the same. They have different, phenomenological qualities, these things, and you can't just say they're all the same. So, but clearly there's this potential for transpersonal realization. Now, you raised the really tricky question, Brian, of why does awareness identify with this representation? Why is there a case of mistaken identity, and why does it persist for most people throughout a lifetime? And that gets trickier. And I don't pretend to have the answer for what are the actual mechanisms. I mean, you can look at various traditions and say, Sankhya, which is the Indian philosophy underlying Patanjali's yoga, the awareness and phenomena, in that tradition, there's a strict dualism, but between awareness and phenomena, including the phenomena of mind. But awareness apparently is said to illuminate mind in such a way that it looks as though it's independent, etc. So, different stories. I'm curious how you've both what you've concluded about what is the mechanism by which vast, boundless, infinite, eternal awareness, and we should qualify infinite, eternal, infinite not in the sense of being really big, but being transspatial, eternal not in the sense of being lasting a long time, but being transtemporal. How does this thing mistake itself for this puny little body mind?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I have a sense that it has to do with the mind's desire to solve problems, and that our sense of ourself actually is made up of these ideas about the problems to solve, because when we relax that idea and when we start allowing things as they are, that identity seems to soften a bit. But I also suppose it's less important to really understand how the mistaken identity happens than what are some great ways to actually see through it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm practically minded myself, and that's largely what we talk about in terms of methods on this podcast. But the why, I would say, because God made it that way, and to be entertained. If you're just awareness, then you miss all the juice, and all the drama. So there's a natural tendency to get lost in stories, and actually that ability to get lost in stories and identity is what really separates humans from most other animals. That we can come up with these stories about green pieces of paper that we say are valuable, or we get stories about this is good and that's bad, and that's allowed us to form a more complex survival of the human family.
Yeah, and that is one of the stories that great traditions come up with, that God did it for amusement.
Yes, yes.
And it's
And
actually
sometimes he has a
interesting.
bad sense of humor.
Really? Yeah. It's interesting that Stan Groff, who's probably the world's greatest psychedelic researcher, who one of his books is The Cosmic Game, in which he took the people who'd had the deepest psychedelic experiences and put them together to piece together their collective experiences into a map of consciousness and cosmology, metaphysics, etc. And he came up, he felt that people that had the deepest experiences had a similar realization to what you're describing, Jonathan, that it was there was a phenomenon which he called divine boredom, that kind of loneliness to just being by yourself. So, create a cosmic game to play, hence the title of the book, The Cosmic Game, which is also very similar to other traditions such as Kashmir Shaivism, that again, Shiva, the pure infinite consciousness, has as part of its potential Shakti, the capacity for universal energy and creation, and also Shakti has the capacity for concealment, to both conceal and reveal the true nature of things. So I think you're pointing out of your own experience to something that is part of our global heritage.
Mm-hmm. You have explored a lot of practices, and some of them are also in the shamanistic tradition, which gets very little bandwidth for most people in the West. Have you found something in that exploration that you found personally useful or found very interesting?
Well, I certainly found it interesting and fascinating. I did shamanic training with Michael Hana, the great shaman Westerner who was trained in shamanism, one of the first, I think probably one of the very first Westerners to be deeply trained in shamanism, and then he distilled the practices from around the world. I found it personally, the thing which got me into shamanism was that after I had kind of got some sense of the practices and ideas behind the great religious traditions and begun to synthesize them in essential spirituality, the one tradition which I could not understand or make sense of was shamanism. And it really took me a long time before I realized, they have a very different focus. Their central practice is what's called the shamanic journey, in which they enter an altered state, experience themselves as souls or spirits who travel through the cosmos, meet other beings, spirits, obtain knowledge and wisdom and power from them, and then bring that power and wisdom back to their tribe to heal and to help and to serve. And that's a very different central practice from the world's great traditions with their focus on more meditative yogic. The shamans also use primarily external stimuli as a way of inducing their altered states, as opposed to the internal stimuli of meditation. So the shamans will rely on things like fasting, exposure to cold or heat, drumming and music and dancing are very important. And so the ways of inducing trance states for them. And they are, trance is an overused term too, but we can use it for now and say they are trance states rather than, say, the meditative exploration, introspective, explorative states of, say, Vipassana, or the pure awareness states of, say, Ramana Maharshi, etc., and Advaita Vedanta.
Wow, that is so fascinating to hear. It really is. But I was just struck by something when you described the journey into other realms and the meeting beings and learning wisdom, bringing it back to your tribe, that actually describes the underlying plot of the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once.
Aha.
It is actually about that, although they couch it in a science fiction alternate universe metaphor. But it's the same. It's the same journey to meet other versions of yourself. In this case, and maybe in shamanism, it's other beings, learning skills, bringing them home to the interpersonal relationships within the family. So interesting.
Mhm.
Hmm.
I appreciate your description, Roger, because my wife is actually into shamanism. I've had
Aha.
a hard time understanding it, and your description made, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. That is what she's doing, and it's nice to have mental maps like that. Um, what do you think? Nowadays, and a large portion of this podcast is geared towards moving towards non-dualism. And I'm wondering your observations. Do those states, in your experience, help people experience psychological maturity, or is that a totally separate pathway?
Well, now we're getting into a place where I have have some charge. I, I, non-dual is getting so overused these days, and that that I have some problems with the use of the term. First off, we need to distinguish between its different uses. It was originally primarily used in association with Advaita Vedanta, or the Hindu tradition, and there it referred to the non-duality of all phenomena, all phenomena, material, mental, etc., and the absolute, or the sat, the chit, ananda, the being, consciousness, bliss of absolute reality, and the idea that those were not, as, for example, yoga had originally thought, strictly dualistic, but rather were of the same nature, that they were manifestations, expressions, projections of the divine, of Brahman, etc. So that was that was the original meaning of non-duality. Then it was kind of, there was a phase in the West where, oh, non-duality is the highest state. Well, then somewhat everyone became non-dual, and non-dual this, non-dual that. It was like quantum physics in the 80s. It's like everything quantum this, quantum that, until the point of nausea. So I now, non-duality seems, and you focus on this more than I, so I'd love your perspective. But from what I can see, it's settled into largely meaning a non-differentiation of self and other, or self, the distinction between the dissolution of the separate self sense. Would you agree with that?
Brian, what are your thoughts?
Well, that certainly is the focus of many teachers, like I would say Angelo DeLullo, who we've had on here, the focus of the dissolution of the sense of the separate self. Although I think that the unity of all things and the idea that we are Brahman, I'm very bad at using ancient terms. I would just say the universe, or what we might call God, is what is looking out our eyes, and the direct experience of that is how I would refer to non-duality.
I like to differentiate as non-dual one and non-dual two. Non-dual one, this is a Michael Taft thing, is that it's awareness and the objects of awareness are actually dualistic. That you can be awareness and you can look out as awareness. And non-dual tool two is where those things actually merge, and you realize that awareness and everything is all just one thing, and there's no sense of an individual self at that point. So you're right that any description on dual actually has to be preceded by what the hell are people talking about? Because everybody has different definitions.
Mm-hmm. But the other problem with non-duality today is I guess you would call it the non-dual police, who would say, well, as soon as you mention anything about your body or your life, and say, oh, that's not non-dual. The expression, so as if to deny our worldly experience as somehow it doesn't exist, it doesn't happen, and people put it out of their minds and say that's not real, that's all illusory. And where if non-duality were true and all is actually just one, then wouldn't that also include duality, include our human experience and our identification with the divine all together simultaneously?
Yeah, some of the critiques of I have trouble with some of the uses of non-dual, and I have trouble with some of the critiques of non-dual too, because some of the critiques are pretty dualistic. That's not part of non-duality. Well, that's a pretty limited view of
right
non-duality. And one of the problems in this whole field of spirituality and contemplative practices, since we're talking about for the large part subjective experiences, it's very easy to be use the terms vaguely, and I think that's in so many cases that's what gets us into trouble. And there's real value in a kind of precision in some of the thinking and analyses about these things, and otherwise they come almost platitudinous in a way.
Yeah, science has been able to proceed and evolve because everything has very precise definitions. Whereas when it comes to spirituality, one person's word of the word God or non-dual or ecstasy or shamanism, nobody really knows what they're talking about, but we all throw these words around. And it'd be nice if there was maybe you can work on this, Roger, a spiritual dictionary, that describes each of these things very precisely.
Well, there's a good opportunity for for conflict. Well, the different definitions.
Although I must say, I just finished your book, Essential Spirituality, and that comes pretty close. I mean, that is a wonderful primer on the entire on so many aspects. It seems to really touch all the bases.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm delighted. Yeah, thanks, Brian.
And speaking of great books, I read your book in 1984 when I was, younger, called Staying Alive, The Psychology of Human Survival. And it really impacted me. I'd say it's in one of the top 20 books I've ever read, in which you talk about how we could use our psychological, spiritual understandings to perhaps create a better world. That was, 39 years ago. I would give ourselves a D in our ability. The entire world did not read your book, Roger, unfortunately. You got the Dalai Lama and Linus Pauling to write forwards for it. So it certainly had a lot of people supporting it, but it seems like we, as a culture right now, this is just my opinion, are not using any of these psychological, spiritual insights to make the world a more healthy place. What's your opinion about that?
Yeah, it's a very sad observation, Jonathan, that the world is in an even more dangerous place, perhaps now than it was in 1984 when I wrote that book, which was at the height of the Cold War. And we could have ended civilization and incinerated ourselves in a matter of hours. Unfortunately, we escaped that at that time anyway. But unfortunately, the complexity and challenges and dangers have multiplied. We have an incredible imbalance between exponential technology and which is just developing at accelerating rates, giving us enormous power, and a very slow evolution of inequalities like ethics, wisdom, altruism, et cetera, et cetera. So this imbalance, of course, is getting worse as we speak. And so we have created a whole new slew of problems that is in the, almost 40 years since that book was written. And we now are facing things like, ecological destruction and new levels and kinds of pollution and artificial intelligence. And it's a long list. In fact, I'm currently doing a final chapter for a book on wise responses to the global crises. And unfortunately, I came up with 10 major challenges we're facing. So, whereas back then it was mainly ecological and nuclear. So our challenges are multiplying. The urgency of the situation, the complexity is multiplying. And we're really in a race between consciousness and catastrophe. And it's not clear which way it's going to go. We are kind of like the sorcerer's apprentice. We have developed enormous power and little wisdom. We've become nuclear giants and technological wizards while remaining ethical infants and wisdom dwarfs. It's just incredible imbalance. What we call our global problems at this stage are really global symptoms. They're symptoms of our technology is so powerful that we've been able to reshape the world in our own image. And once you realize that, you see that our global problems are actually global symptoms. I'd say to help, the positive thing is that there are far more people deeply concerned about these issues than there were when that original book was written. There's a rapidly growing movement of deeply concerned people. And unfortunately, what we call normality, we can now recognize is, at least from my perspective, an unrecognized collective developmental arrest. And it's a deluded state of mind. And so we've really got a lot of work to do if we're going to make it as a civilization. And, unfortunately, there have been lots of civilizations that have destroyed themselves before. The great historian Arnold Toynbee said that most civilizations actually end by suicide. So there's no reason we couldn't be the same.
Is there any place that you tend to put your hope?
Well, I think as I mentioned, in the number of people who are awakening to the issues, far more than before. There are just a lot of people who are awakening to this. The number of people who are adopting novel perspectives, for example, trying to bring different perspectives and approaches to these issues. The other thing is what you implied earlier, the acceleration of spiritual practices in the world. And I said we're in a race in consciousness and catastrophe. It's kind of, in one sense, it sounds like just like a catchy line, but it is. I think it is true. Mm-hmm. And so I think the question is, how can we encourage people to become active in learning about and responding to these crises, and what can we do to increase the number of people doing deep, sustained contemplative practice? Because my sense is that as people do deep practice, they become more sensitive to the social and global challenges and dysfunctions we face, and more motivated to do something about them, and hopefully to do them from a deeper perspective, which recognizes their psychological and spiritual roots as well as their external manifestations and symptoms. One final thing, which hasn't happened much, but I hope will, and that is that social and global activism will become married with contemplative practice, mm-hmm. particularly in the form of a practice you mentioned in your book, The Enlightenment Project, Jonathan, that is karma yoga. Karma yoga is the yoga of work and action in the world, in which the central focus of one's practice is one's work in the world. And there is a way of transforming one's work in the world into a profound practice. And if anyone's interested, I've done a couple of articles on this, which you can find on the web on Karma Yoga. Just seems like a really important practice for our times. And I just encourage people to look into it. And if you're a serious spiritual practitioner, you're either in a monastery doing intensive practice, or you're in the world. And if you're in the world, one of the core recommendations across traditions is do your practice continuously. Well, if you're working and engaged in family and etc., how do you do your practice continually? Well, Karma Yoga is the time-honored answer to that question. Mm-hmm. And so maybe I can just say, very little about it. Should I do that?
Yeah, I we talked to Tammy Simon of Sounds True about Karma Yoga, and she said some things that really impacted me. And I think it's a discussion in spiritual circles that is underrepresented.
I would agree completely, Jonathan. And its essence, it's a simple practice. It's the classic text is the Hindu Bhagavad Gita, which describes the Karma Yogas as offering one's actions to God, doing the actions as impeccable and work as impeccably as one can, while simultaneously, and this is the kicker, releasing attachment to the outcome. Now, that's the threefold essence. Of course, there's great benefit in having a more detailed map of things to do, such as, okay, well, we don't have to go through them all now. You probably don't want to go through a detailed description of the practice, but there are ways of refining that and looking at the elements one can bring together to make it a really profound and effective practice that requires no extra time. You're just doing your work, but you're doing it with a particular attitude and heightened awareness.
To get the article, would you just Google Roger Walsh Karma Yoga?
Yeah, that should do it.
That sounds good.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, that is, I think, really can be inspiring and help people who say, well, what can I do? What do I do? This is, the most common question. They might understand theoretically, but people want to know, and what can I do? And what do I do? And that's one way. And also your book, Essential Spirituality, is actually filled with practical techniques that you can just do them, just try them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Brian. And I will give another, at the risk of giving another self-plug, I recently recognized that exactly what you just said, that, gosh, I'm not the only one struggling to figure out what to do. So I actually wrote an article, which is on the web, a couple of forms, one under the Integral Life website, another under Perspectiva website, on titled something like "What Can I Do?" Looking at what are the principles by which we can first discover our unique contribution, because all of us have a unique contribution by virtue of our own particular talents and capacities and contacts, etc. And once we have a sense of what we are drawn to, then how do we do it most skillfully and effectively in the most profound way? So I think those are kind of the koans for each of us at this time.
Mm-hmm. Well said. What are you currently working on? You tend not to stay still. What's your latest passion?
Let's see. There are two things motivating Jonathan. Writing and like you, a podcast. Right, the writing is. I hesitate to say this, but I'm trying to finish a book on wisdom, which has taken me 8 years. Needless to say, it's. I'm hoping it rubs off, but it's been quite a challenge, as you can imagine, doing a book on wisdom. But
you could always have Chat GPT write it.
Well, I tried that. It was not not as wise as I'd hoped.
Yeah, right.
But probably in a couple of years, it'd be able to do it. So that's one project. The other is like your own, doing a podcast over this last year. And I would like to mention that because I suspect that our listeners will overlap. Ours would probably be very interested to hear of your Explorers podcast, and yours may be interested to hear of ours, which is Deep Transformation, Self, Society, Spirit. And that pretty much describes what we're about, we're really interested in. What is deep transformation, both of oneself, of society, and what is personal, psychological, spiritual, social, global transformation, and how can we foster that? And so there's a lot of overlap. And one of our deep concerns is how can we transform in ways which will enable us to become more effective instruments of help and healing, particularly at this really dangerous time we're in.
And the co-host of that podcast is John Dupuy. Is that correct?
It is, yeah. John Dupuy, who I think you know, and a wonderful human being who founded the integral recovery movement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I have a question about, there's likely to be FDA approval of MDMA therapy. And I actually am teaching a course on that to facilitators. Do you think that has much ability to heal people, or do you know anything about it? Or what are your thoughts about the whole use of psychedelics coming back and MDMA coming back to potentially give people therapeutic and transpersonal wisdom?
Well, a lot of us worked really hard for this moment, for the legitimization of psychedelics as therapeutic and spiritual tools, and I think a lot of us are also concerned. Let's say that there's a lot of evidence that these are very powerful therapeutic tools. So before the research was locked down, there were something like 1,000 studies that were done, and they're almost totally forgotten now. But the evidence was clear. They could be remarkably therapeutic in very difficult situations, such as addiction, for example, or near death, people approaching death, and etc. So lots of promise there, and of course a history across large parts of the world of their use in spiritual traditions. Shamanism, you had mentioned, Jonathan, and psychedelics were a major part of shamanism, but they also played subsidiary roles in a variety of other traditions. They don't get much press, but they've been around dated back archaeologically to at least 9,000 years ago. Probably for shamanic use, and so these have been widely used and in spiritual traditions, and now we have the potential of using them therapeutically. I think that's wonderful, and I think there are a couple of dangers. One is that they are currently being hyped in ways which are reminiscent of the 60s, the cure-alls, and they're not. Nothing is. Second, I think the risks are being minimized by some people, and there are some people who just should not use psychedelics. That's flat out. If you've had, say, manic depressive disorder, or psychotic episode, watch out, etc., etc. So, but the research is clear that with adequate screening and adequate care and supervision or guidance, these can be extraordinarily safe for some people and extremely valuable. So the other challenge is that there is a flood of capitalism. The word that was going to come to mind was vultures descending on the field, wanting to make a buck out of them, and so much of their value has been the spiritual dimension. And I just don't see how it's going to be possible to have profit as the central motive and retain the spiritual profundity and depths and intentions with these things. So that's That's a big challenge. There's an interesting question about their role in spiritual practice, and they have been spiritual tools, but what's their role? So I was very intrigued by that. So some years ago, I did a little study. I interviewed 6 spiritual teachers, all of whom were certified in their own traditions as teachers and were recognized, actually a lot of them quite well recognized teachers. And all of them had a profound opening with psychedelics. So here were people who could compare. And what they said was almost unanimous. It was quite striking. All of them agreed that, yes, these tools can be very valuable if used in the context of a spiritual practice. By themselves, they do not constitute a path, but they can be very valuable spiritual adjuncts. So that was a pretty clear answer.
Great, great. Any last questions, Brian, that you want to give before we maybe go into a guided meditation?
No, I'm curious, Roger. You mentioned before we started that you had recently come across a meditation that you might be interested in sharing with our listeners.
Yeah, I did, Brian. And given that I don't feel as familiar with it as I probably should before offering it to others, and also because one of our central focuses here has been in our discussion has been on our global crises and how we can become more effective instruments of service. I think I'd like to just offer a brief little meditation for anyone who's interested which can be a very brief but very powerful way of enhancing one's skills and capacities for life and for service.
That sounds perfect. Yeah, that sounds perfect.
Are we ready?
Yep.
Sure.
Okay, so I invite you to just take a moment to relax. If you're in a safe place to do so, feel free to close your eyes. And take a couple of slow, deep breaths. Breathing in and letting go. Breathing in and letting go. And I invite you to think of some quality or capacity or skill that you feel would be really beneficial for you to have. A skill or capacity which would enable you to live more fully, contribute more effectively, be more joyful. And think of that quality. And now bring to mind, or allow your mind to come up with, someone who really is an example of that quality, that capacity, an exemplar, a role model who really embodies that quality of heart and mind. It could be someone you know, it could be someone you've heard of, it could be a historical figure, or it could be an archetype, an image. But someone who really embodies and has that quality, capacity as a strength. And now see that person in front of you. See that person who embodies this quality, this capacity, this strength, this virtue that you would benefit from. Feel what it's like to be with them. And now visualize this person melting inward, just melting inward into light, so that they become a condensed ball of light, energy, and this quality. Light and energy embodying this quality. And then bring this ball of light up and oh, so it's just over your head, center of your head. And imagine it coming down through the crown, down the neck and spine, and coming into the heart. And when it comes into the heart, this ball of light, energy, virtue explodes through your body mind, filling it, imbuing it with this quality, this capacity. So now this virtue, this strength, this excellence fills your body mind, pervades it. And this virtue, this strength is now one of your great strengths. And feel what it's like to embody this quality, this strength. What posture is associated with it? You might like to even exaggerate that posture a little bit and store the experience of that strength and that posture that it evokes. And so now, anytime you wish, you can just evoke this memory, this image, this body posture, and that strength, that virtue will be fully available to you. And when you're ready, bring that quality back with you as you open your eyes. Come back to your environment, but embodying that quality, able to more effectively serve and more joyfully and fully live. Beautiful. Okay.
I love that meditation. I'm very grateful for that.
I loved it too. And it really serves what we love to do on this podcast, which is offering things that are just really useful and helpful to our listeners. So I'm very grateful to you for that and for this entire conversation.
Well, it's been a joy. Thank you so much for the good work you do. And thanks for the invitation to explore together over this hour. It's been great.
How can people find out about your website is drrogerwalsh.com.
Right, yep. I think most of my articles and talks are up there. So and the podcast again is Deep Transformation, Self-Society, Spirit. I think between those two should give you enough to keep busy and get bored. So
and your many books, which I highly recommend. You're a very clear writer that can kind of say stuff in a way that you go, yeah, uh-huh.
Yeah, I like that.
That's wonderful. I'm delighted. Thank you.
Well, I thank our Patreon supporters. People can go to patreon.com/awareness explorers and support us and get a bunch of goodies if you want. And any last words from Brian or Roger?
Oh, just thank you for this opportunity. It's wonderful to be able to have a conversation at this level and to explore around these topics with fellow explorers. So thank you.
Yes, and that really sums it up for me too. Just thank you very much, and for the generosity of your time and wisdom, and the best of luck on your new book.
Thank you.
Until next time, friends, keep exploring.
Keep exploring.
Thank you for listening to Awareness Explorers. To learn more, you can check out our website at awarenessexplorers.com. Please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast app. We'd love it if you would post a review. And please share our link on Facebook and with family and friends, because knowing yourself as awareness is the greatest gift you can give yourself or someone you love.